Good morning. Welcome to our first Think About Energy for 2021. What you should notice is some differences, a different platform. However, with it being a new year and hearing feedback from our viewers, we felt it was necessary to make certain that everything we were doing last year, we could step it up this year. So hopefully the feedback that you guys and gals provided us, you'll see that betterment this year. But it's important that we get your feedback. So make certain you let us know what your thoughts are as we prepare for a new year, a new platform, even a new time, 10 o'clock. But the bottom line is we're hoping for the same serious content that gives you an overview of what's happening in the energy space. Folks have asked me, why do we do these? What's the point? And the goal is we want to make certain that we're informing you of issues that are going on. The majority of the folks who are listening in, their careers are engaged in the energy field. So we want to make certain that you're informed. But information is good. We want to go a little further. We want to get a little more education so you can discern between policies that are out there and have that education to ask questions and to have that debate. But we can't leave it there because we need you to advocate. And from advocating, what we mean is we want to make certain that when you want to take action, you have that information. So that is why we're into year 12 of Think About Energy, but we're constantly striving to make these better. So again, as you know, my name is George Stark. I'm with Cabot Oil and Gas. But again, this is a Think About Energy opportunity that we want to make certain that you're aware of what's going on. We have many people to thank. And I'll do that at the end. I want to thank everyone who joined us today. And at the end of the day, we're going to have a conversation about what's happening in Washington, D.C., but it doesn't just happen there. It rolls out into the states. And from the states, you've got folks, politicians, elected officials, legislators who are deciding what to do. So we think today we have a good opportunity to have a Think About Energy with a focus on D.C., Biden's administration, the changes that he's making there, but then to hear from someone like Kevin Sunday at the state chamber to talk about that interaction between what's happening in DC and how it impacts Harrisburg politics. And Kevin, fortunately, is aware of what's going on, whether it's Ohio or West Virginia, likewise. So again, looking broadly. And then lastly, we'll end with Tracy Lawless, who really has the opportunity to help us with the intersection of policy and politicians, the people that are in this, and how they are representing you, their constituents. But before we get to them, we're blessed that Bradbury, the CEO of AXPC, has joined us. Ann is somebody who has a real good sense of what's happening in DC, totally engaged in the efforts of the new Biden administration. So again, it's my pleasure to welcome Ann to the Think About Energy this morning. Ann, thank you for taking time. You are very busy with change coming from DC.
Indeed, I am. Thanks so much, George, for having us today. And thank you to everyone for what you do as I sit in my warm house on this cold and dreary day. And so many of our friends across the country are without power due to extreme weather. And I just want to say thank you for all you do. And I'm very grateful for the of affordable, available, reliable energy that I'm enjoying today to be on this podcast.
Thank God it's abundant. Thank God it's abundant, no doubt.
Exactly.
Yes, well,
if you're ready, I'm happy to jump right in.
I'm definitely ready. I just want to say again, thank you for joining us. I'm going to get out of this picture frame. You're going to run the show. I'll talk to you after you're done.
Sounds good. Thanks, George. So I'd like to start today just really quickly touching on Congress and what that looks like and what we can expect there. So as you all are aware, given the outcome of the Georgia Senate races, we are currently in a world with unified Democrat control of both the White House and Congress. But I'd like to put that into context a little bit. The last time that there was unified Democrat control was 2008 to 2010. And during that time, the Speaker Pelosi had about a 36-seat advantage in the House, and Harry Reid had 59 senators in the Democrat senators in the Senate. Today, the Democrat margin in the House is in the single digits, and the Senate is evenly split, with Vice President Harris being the tiebreaker. Given that, in addition to the sort of shifting politics on the Democrat side that we've seen over the last 10 years, this is just a very different governing majority than one that we've seen before. And given the sort of divisions that we see within the party, with many on the left going much further left than they were 10 years ago, yet many in the center sort of holding the center, in addition to the very, very, very small, narrow margins that they have in the House and the Senate, governing and legislating on a grand scale is going to be incredibly difficult for Democrats to do on a unified basis. A lot of legislation will still require bipartisan support to move forward. Most of the must-do items that we're going to see this Congress, such as appropriations bills, government funding, will still need to be done on a bipartisan basis. The Senate has said that they are, at least key senators have said that they plan to retain the filibuster. So most legislation in the Senate will need 60 votes. The exception to that, as you all have heard about, is reconciliation. And reconciliation are categories of bills that affect tax or direct spending. So the only partisan legislating that is going to be able to happen for the next 2 years are things that fall into the reconciliation bucket, so affect taxes or direct spending, and will also have to have the essentially unanimous support of every Democrat in Congress. So from Joe Manchin to Bernie Sanders, and from a Representative Lizzie Fletcher from Houston to an AOC from New York. So it's a really tall order, and it means that while you will see a pretty active and engaged legislative agenda, particularly the first half of the year, it's not as aggressive or ambitious as it will not be able to be as aggressive or ambitious as the Biden administration would like it to be. What we're seeing right now is they are going down a partisan path to pass a COVID relief package and using reconciliation to do that. Because Congress didn't pass a budget last year, they will be able to do another reconciliation package later this year. And that's where we expect a lot of climate provisions, infrastructure provisions, tax provisions that would affect our industry in particular. We could go to the next slide. So from our perspective, these are actually the biggest legislative threats that fall into that bucket. And most of these would have to be done through reconciliation, although a couple of them, it's a little unclear whether they could fit into a reconciliation bucket. But one of the biggest things that we're concerned about is tax changes that could happen on a partisan basis. Biden campaigned quite aggressively on eliminating quote unquote subsidies for the oil and gas industry. And because tax provisions do fall under the reconciliation rubric, that is certainly an area that we can look to have to play defense a little bit. We also know that they're looking to lower to raise the corporate rate to undo some of the Trump era tax provisions. There are a number of other tax policies that are potentially on the table as well that are very concerning. Not a huge issue for folks in Pennsylvania, but another thing that can be done through reconciliation is changing or increasing federal royalty rates. This is the royalty rates that operators on federal lands pay to the federal government. That's something that we understand they would be looking to do in a reconciliation package moving forward. A clean energy standard. This is something that the Biden campaign also talked about before the election. It is unclear whether or not this could be done through reconciliation, but it's also something that they are potentially looking at trying to get bipartisan support for. but some sort of clean energy standard that will look a little bit like the Clean Power Plan that we saw out of the Obama administration, but something that mandates the use of fuel in our power sector mix to really incentivize more renewables in that sector. And then finally, I'm putting a lot of things into this fourth bucket called market manipulation. This includes subsidies that renewables receive, incentives for electric vehicles, things like that. Anything that they can do to make renewables, electric vehicles, things like that more affordable and available in the market, given that they are not generally without subsidies, are another thing that we will see both on the legislative front and regulatory front. Moving on to the regulatory outlook, given that Congress can only accomplish so much given the very narrow margins, we believe that the Biden administration will take a really maximalist approach to regulatory policy. This is sort of a funny little graph, but what it is intended to illustrate is that Obama-era regulations will essentially serve as the floor or a starting point for where the Biden administration is going to look in terms of new regulations. They will look to make regulations both more stringent, and they're going to really push the bounds of how much they can do through regulatory policy. They are also going to initiate regulation in agencies where climate policy has not historically been a priority. So the SEC, for example, will certainly be coming out with new climate-related regulations on public companies. Additionally, agencies like the CFTC, the Department of Transportation, FERC, which approves interstate pipelines, the State Department, so foreign policy, every agency is now a climate agency in the Biden administration. Next slide, please. So drilling down on that a little bit and looking at the expected regulatory action, I'm going to try to bucket kind of what we see on the regulatory front into a few different categories. So the first is more stringent environmental regulations in sort of traditional areas like the EPA and DOI. We know that methane regulation will be early out of the gate. That's already been announced in an early executive order, and it's something the agency is currently working on. We expect other air and water regulations certainly to follow in relatively short order. Access to capital. So again, this is a newer area of climate regulation, but one that we do expect to be fairly active. We think that they will require all public companies be required to disclose climate risks, additional regulation around ESG disclosures, and regulation that is aimed at squeezing or reducing access to capital from investors and banks is also something that is very possible. Restricting access, generally speaking, this is something that we've already seen, certainly on federal lands, but we also expect it to go beyond that in terms of slowdowns in infrastructure permitting. We've seen the cancellation of the Keystone Pipeline, slowdowns in operational permitting. So where the federal government has a role in infrastructure permitting or permitting of oil and gas operations, we expect that to move a little more slowly and potentially be subject to new regulatory requirements. Demand destruction. So again, as you all are aware, most of the above policies won't actually do much to reduce emissions. Important footnote. It will simply just move production and transportation elsewhere. So in addition to all of this, the administration will also try to manipulate demand through mandating energy sources be used in the power sector, through increasing subsidies for renewables and electric vehicles, through putting federal procurement requirements on agencies to purchase less fossil fuel vehicles or vehicles that use fossil fuels, for example. So really all of the tools at their disposal to kind of prop up demand for renewables and electrification. Another key area where there hasn't really been a huge area of focus, but I think is something that the industry really needs to be thinking about, is in the area of enforcement. The Biden administration the Biden campaign had on its website even the threat of jail time for executives for oil and gas executives who are, polluting. And so we believe that they're going to take a very different approach to enforcement. The Trump administration's approach to enforcement was really a compliance approach. The Biden administration, particularly from the EPA and the Department of Justice, will likely be much more punitive. They will likely look to make an example out of companies with violations, particularly those in the oil and gas sector. And then one final note on the regulatory front, I do think it's important to point out that there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen when it comes to climate policy. And in addition to every agency now being a climate agency, there are two new czars in the White House that are intended to be coordinating and driving climate policy. Gina McCarthy, Senator Kerry. McCarthy has the domestic portfolio, Kerry has the international portfolio. But this sets up a situation where there is likely to be a good deal of confusion around who is actually making the decisions in the administration. For the time being, while agency heads are still going through the confirmation process, the unconfirmed quote unquote czars are really running point on climate policy and energy policy for the time being. But it is a bit unclear who will be calling the shots moving forward. And that's an issue of great interest both to the industry, but also to Congress as they look to exercise their oversight role over the administration. Next slide, please. So as we look at sort of the risks and the threats that face the industry, we also do think it's important to look for opportunities where they may exist as well. And some potential areas for this include LNG exports. So as countries around the globe look to meet their Paris goals, US LNG has to play a key role in this. China continues to build hundreds of new coal-fired power plants, and US LNG can really be a very key tool in the United States helping other countries meet their Paris commitments, and doing so in a way that supports US jobs, supports our national security, and actually reduces global emissions. Additionally, the White House announced last week a climate innovation working group and a $100 million commitment to fund transformational low carbon energy technologies. My trade association has come out in support of a robust innovation agenda because we know that fossil fuels are here to stay. And things like carbon capture, utilization, sequestration, blue hydrogen show great promise for both making a real impact on emissions and supporting good paying jobs, all the while maintaining our quality of life. So these are a couple areas that we do hope to work with the administration on. Finally, I added quote unquote common sense regulation here. And, for example, we know that that federal regulation of methane of both new and existing sources is happening. And AXPC companies want to be very careful to not simply oppose everything the Biden administration is doing. We go over and above, as you all know, what is sort of the required under federal and state law. We invest hundreds of millions of dollars in new technologies to tackle the methane problem. And so we would really like to work with this administration on developing regulation that incentivizes these new technologies and incentivizes companies to continue innovating to reduce emissions, as opposed to a compliance-heavy command and control approach that might actually not be the best fit for reducing emissions in a cost-effective way. So where we can work with this administration on regulations that support that shared goal of emissions reductions while continuing domestic production of oil and gas, we're going to look for opportunities to do that. And where regulation is sort of overly restrictive or aggressive, we will oppose them. But we would like to go in with a constructive approach and work with them where we can. And I am more than happy to take questions at the end of the presentation after my esteemed colleagues. But for now, I will turn it back over to George.
Well, you know what, Anne, again, I appreciate your summary of what we're faced with, because again, it is a challenge. We know the states are difficult, but a change in administration is going to be massive. The one question, and whether you want to think about it now or possibly have an answer, is, we are seeing that every cabinet official has a climate expert. I'm hearing that Janet Yellen is going to have a climate expert on staff. Likewise, at some point, are we concerned about if they have the authority to have all these people on board, and does their mission support what they're trying to get done? So I'm curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, my initial thought is, from a staffing perspective, they can hire people and give people titles to look at these issues. I think there's, pretty broad authority there. I think the question in terms of authority will come when they actually start putting forward rules and regulations that industry have to comply with. And where, we believe agencies are overstepping their authority, I think you'll see industry pushback in the form of litigation.
Understood. And again, you don't want litigation to be the end goal, but it's clear that on all sides, that's going to be a situation. So, and
one of the tools in the toolbox.
You're true. That's true. Thank you for this. I appreciate your overview. To your point, we are going to transition to the states, but you're not going anywhere, because you'll be ready for questions and answers. And again, for those viewers, please, if you have questions, you can apply them through the chat, but most people, I think, are best to just send them straight to Natalie. So again, that's an easy way to do that. You see, there's the opportunity, thinkaboutbriefings.com. As we do that and we transition from DC to Pennsylvania and state capitals, Kevin, I gotta believe that you're listening to what Anne's talking about and you're thinking, oh, taxation, regulatory overreach, situations dealing with clean energy. None of those issues are you faced with in the states. I mean, it's milk and honey for the states. I jest. Kevin, I appreciate you coming on, because as Anne laid out, it's an aggressive challenge for us in DC, and you're not seeing any lessening on your side. Anne talks tax, you got severance tax. Anne talks clean energy, you've got Reggie and the like. So I'm interested in hearing your overview and this notion of how, whether we collide or we are interwoven, how we are best situated to take advantage of what's happening in DC and where we need to be on the offensive as well as defense. So I'll step back. I'll give you the show, Kevin. It's all yours, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity, George. Really appreciate to join you all this morning, and really an honor to join Anne and Tracy, two tremendous leaders on the energy and public policy front. So my name is Kevin Sunday. I'm Director of Government Affairs with the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry. And we're the largest broad-based business advocacy organization in the state. And as George sort of alluded to, one of the just wonderful things about working in Pennsylvania is we look at the diversity of the economy, the political breakdown. We really are a microcosm of national dynamics. So everything that's being discussed in DC, we have going on in Harrisburg, but a couple key differences. One is we have to have a balanced budget. So some of these taxation discussions come right to the front burner every year. And I think the other thing is that we have term limits on the governor, and we have a lot of turnover in the legislature. So where we are situated in Harrisburg right now is the governor is in his 7th of his 8 years, so he's lame duck. And then we have a legislature that 1/3 of them are in their first or second terms. So we have a governor who is working on some legacy items, George alluded to, severance tax and Reggie, and I'll touch on those, as well as some other environmental policy items. And then we have a lot of fresh faces in the House and Senate. Contrary to DC, There's some lawyers in the House and Senate, but we have insurance salesmen, teachers, nurses, small businessmen. It's really a body that I think looks like the state. But the challenge there is folks are new. So they don't know that we're coming up on the 9th anniversary of Act 13 that modernized the state's approach to regulating oil and gas drilling, municipal land use regulation, and imposing an impact fee that's collected $2 billion statewide for conservation, infrastructure, parks and recreation across all 67 counties in the state. That's new to them. They might not know why we deregulated the electricity markets going on 25 years ago under Governor Ridge, and how that's resulted in a much cleaner grid and a cheaper grid and a secure grid. They might not appreciate why Pennsylvania's the powerhouse electricity generator in the 13-state PJM grid, where we export more power than anybody in that 13 grid system that goes from the Atlantic Ocean to Chicago. We export a third of our power. We export a lot of natural gas. So we're keeping the lights on in the mid-Atlantic and Midwest. And when folks just want to sort of hunker down and be myopic on Pennsylvania energy policy, they miss the reasons of why we took those steps. So we, as a collective, we, the chamber, the business allies, everyone on this call, we want to rally together and have that education and then talk about what does it look like we build on those strengths, we evaluate the merits of those good past decisions in terms of competitiveness and good energy policy, and then we build on that. Because even during this pandemic, we're still competing for investment. We see the decisions of other states. Folks are talking about uprooting their financial businesses from New York. Tech companies are leaving California. The president, both past and current, we have now 2 White Houses are talking about they want to onshore and reshore manufacturing. So do we have the workforce to build on that? Do we have the tax policy that encourages that? And so we're rallying around a recovery agenda to come out of this pandemic stronger than ever. And that's Bringing PA Back is our recovery initiative. It's an effort where we're going to leverage strengths in the private sector and put before our allies in the General Assembly, House and Senate, and the governor's office and say, here is a way to put politics aside and put Pennsylvanians first. We're going to rise to the challenge and drive investment and job growth to Pennsylvania and make sure there's a quality of opportunity for everyone in this state. There's a lot of challenges that are out there, but maybe the biggest one is just how old this state is getting. Our fastest growing segment of the population is those folks 60 and up. And folks my age and younger, there's fewer and fewer of us, and many are leaving the state to go to other places that have more opportunity. We want to improve our competitive position and increase investment. We want to see more family-sustaining jobs and an equality of opportunity for every Pennsylvanian. So I would invite you to join us at bringingpaback.com, and then we can build and learn from one another and engage the legislature with a pro-growth, forward-thinking agenda that turns to business leaders to achieve these goals. There's been a lot of discussion in polling lately. Is it capturing things correctly or not? But one poll that I would point you to that does have a lot of merit and good methodology is the Edelman Trust. And they're asking folks, who do you trust? Do you trust the media? Do you trust your elected officials? Do you trust business? Who do you think has the integrity and the capacity to solve the world's biggest problems? And the only segment out there that people across the board trust to get things done and to have the capacity to do it is business. So we've got to look to the private sector to lead. Now, with that being said, let's touch on a couple energy points, and then I'll kick it back to you, George. As Ann mentioned, the current White House, the Biden administration, they're talking about a lot of steps on energy, including making it difficult to get a new interstate pipeline built. Therefore, it's incumbent upon the state legislature, we believe, and the governor's office to do everything they can to attract investment to Pennsylvania. Now, a lot of companies and their boards are asking the question on sustainability and climate. And a lot of folks are doing a lot of really innovative things, whether that's setting a zero emissions target at their well sites, cutting down on fugitive leaks through the pipeline systems, using alternative fuels like compressed natural gas in their fleets to reduce emissions and cut costs. And this is the dynamic that I think gets underappreciated in a lot of the energy discussions. The state's alternative energy portfolio standard, which is the requirement that a certain percentage of our electricity come from wind, solar, and other alternative sources. That was passed under the Rendell administration when we had hurricanes in the Gulf knocking out rigs. We had turmoil in the Middle East. We had rate caps coming off in Pennsylvania where electricity prices are really high. And so the discussion wasn't really climate. The discussion was energy security and why are energy costs really high. I don't like paying $4 a gallon. I don't like paying $200 a month for electricity. We need to look at something different. We're in a very different position now. Emissions across the board are way down, and so are costs. I mentioned PJM, the interstate grid. We have the cheapest prices in that grid's 25-year history. And that's as we've seen a more diverse energy portfolio get built out that's also much cleaner from a CO2, NOx, SOx, et cetera perspective. But I think there's a really good story to tell in terms of competitive markets. Now, Governor Wolf has directed DEP to try to get Pennsylvania into the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is an interstate cap and trade program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. But if I mentioned PJM goes from the Atlantic Ocean to Chicago, PJM, that's PJM, and everyone's there competing to produce power on the cheapest basis. Meanwhile, RGGI would go from Virginia to Maine. And so we've got folks that aren't in PJM that are in RGGI, and we would have states in PJM that aren't in RGGI. And so Pennsylvania sort of becomes this dividing line where we're trying to compete on price against 13 other states. We're also setting compliance obligations with states that aren't in our same power system. And why that's really important is, and what we've raised time and again throughout this process is, we agree we want to drive down emissions as much as possible. But if we don't account for the fact that the coal-heavy states of West Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, they're competing against us as well. We jump into RGGI and we don't address for what's called leakage. Sure, we'll reduce operations from fossil fuel plants in Pennsylvania, but that generation is just going to go to other states in PJM, and as a nation, not really going to have much meaningful emissions change. But we've hurt our competitive position. So that's something that we want to make sure we're thinking through before we jump into this, as well as consider the impacts of some of these approaches coming down from DC. One of the big discussions throughout the campaign was, as president, would Joe Biden ban fracking? He was pretty clear in the primary that, yes, no question about it. And then as he came through the general, he sort of walked that back and said, no, I'm not going to ban fracking. Well, next week we're going to find out. At the Delaware River Basin Commission, which is a 4-state interstate water management agency that the federal government has a seat on, they have a regulatory docket to vote on about whether or not drilling is going to be banned permanently in the basin. That impacts Northeast Pennsylvania. So we're going to find out through Biden's nominee, Biden's designee at the RBC, if we're going to ban fracking or not. We're also going to find out a lot of these other states that are in the Delaware River Basin Commission are RGGI states. So what does it mean when we join up with states that are going to take votes and take environmental policy that maybe doesn't put Pennsylvania's interests and economy first? And then the last thing I'll mention, and this relates to the shale drilling conversation, is for the 7th year, the governor has laid out pushing for a severance tax. There's been different iterations. It's been a bond issue. It's been a general fund. We think it's, again, just the wrong policy for the state. We have the impact fee, as I alluded to. We're in the 9th year of that. It's working well. It's collecting more revenue than most other states with the severance tax, and it's provided certainty to the industry. We layer a severance tax onto that, and now we are requiring an industry that's already paying Pennsylvania's uncompetitive business taxes and the impact fee and a pretty challenging regulatory climate. And then we're saying one more severance tax. And it's very frustrating when we see things like the Philadelphia Inquirer and an op-ed say, basically, well, Governor, why don't you just extort the industry and withhold permits until they agree to a severance tax? Well, we think that's just totally misguided. And so we are continuing to push as a coalition. We have many partners across trade associations in town, from aggregates and concrete, forestry, home builders, small business manufacturers. We're at stopnewenergytaxes.com. You can see our coalition efforts there as we're underway with another hopefully successful advocacy campaign to keep severance tax off the books. as our allies in the House and Senate, with Republican majorities, work to wrap up the state budget on or before June 30th, and then leverage Pennsylvania's economy into a pro-growth strategy where we're recovering and we come out of this better than we ever were. So that's my overview. I'm happy to dive into some other things as the dialogue allows. But again, thank you, George, for inviting us. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in and getting engaged on this important issue.
Kevin, again, thank you for joining us. You know, by nature, I'm an optimistic person. I wake up every morning and I'm excited to do my job. But when you think about the challenges that you're laying out, that Ann's laying out, we got a tough fight ahead of ourselves. I mean, there's going to be days I'm going to want to pull the covers up and just stay there because these challenges, you know, withhold permits to get a fee for a tax. Oh, and by the way, then we'll question if the grid can operate because there won't be enough gas going to it. It's so cattywampus. It's frustrating to see. And honestly, Kevin, I don't know where to start with the idea that maybe what's happening in Texas is a better opportunity for us to really have a conversation about RGGI and this notion of, wait a minute, you have a grid here in Pennsylvania that's working. Any thoughts early on that side of it when you look at RGGI?
Yeah, our hearts go out to everyone in Texas. It is such a challenging situation. It just seems like it's a slow-moving disaster, and it's a horrible thing when you see the reports of folks doing carbon monoxide poisoning, hospital evacuations. It's horrible. So it highlights the importance of being thoughtful about energy policy, highlights the merits of an approach like PJM, where we got generation across 13 states, and it highlights the merits of making sure we have the infrastructure there that as different folks in different states and communities need the energy, it can get there. Because Texas has a lot of energy, but not having the infrastructure to get it where it's needed is as good as not having the energy in the first place.
We have really our battles picked out for us in DC and in Harrisburg, Charleston, as well as Columbus. We've got work to do. I appreciate what you're doing for us, Kevin. Again, we got to stay at the ready. You're educating people. You're making advocates out of them. I appreciate that. I'm going to transition from you, but one of the things you said is so critical, and this is where Tracy plays a role. It's this idea that 1/3 of the General Assembly is new. So, when I am putting my budget together inside of Cabot, we're constantly advocating. And the question is, haven't you told them the story already, George? Why do you need to tell them again? But the reality is, I've got new fire chiefs, I've got new township supervisors, and we got new legislators. So again, Kevin, thank you. Tracy, I'm excited to hear from you because you're the person that's the interaction between the people and the policies. So I'm excited for you. I want to remain optimistic. I don't want to keep my covers over my head. I'm going to do everything I can to keep fighting, even if I'm with Billy DeRozier. It's my goal. But walk us through, Tracy, what you're seeing in this DC/Harrisburg, Columbus, Charleston environment. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks a lot, George. Thanks to Cabot Oil and Gas for having me and all your sponsors today. As George said, I'm Tracy Lawless, and I'm part of the K&L Gates Policy Practice Group. And while my practice area actually focuses more on healthcare policy, and certainly the healthcare sector and health systems are impacted by energy policy, I was selected this summer to be a volunteer with the Biden-Harris 2020 Policy Committee, where we vetted the day one and first 100-day policy proposals. And then in addition to that, I was named as a Biden delegate for the DNC convention this summer. So with that, I'm part of the team here also in Pennsylvania that represents Cabot Oil and Gas on state issues in Harrisburg. I also want to say that my crystal ball is broken, so I won't be making any predictions this morning. And my remarks are my own, and they don't reflect that of any elected officials or my firm. Okay, so on to the first slide, Natalie. So as part of the panel discussion, I was asked, as George said, to bring the political perspective to the conversation. And I think When we think about where politics intersects with policy, especially energy policy, it's really not a simple one-way street intersecting with another one like a photo on the left. It's really more like the photo on the right that entails a spaghetti plate of multiple intersections that are intertwined with a lot of chaos and disruption. Next slide. So I thought to better understand where we are now in the Biden administration and in Pennsylvania, and sort of to recap the materials that Ann went through, let's take a look back where we started in 2016 when Trump ran for president. A lot of this is going to evolve around geography, and geography played a key role because we saw Trump spent a lot of time where there was a strong presence of labor unions, small disenfranchised towns, and mostly in Rust Belt regions of the country. Then we get to 2019 and we see that juxtaposition of the Green New Deal versus the drill baby drill mantra. And keep in mind, the Green New Deal was never an actual bill. It was really a resolution that got 0 Democrat votes in the Senate. And recall that when that was running, Leader McConnell at the time kind of ran it as a procedural vote to get Democrats on the record. But you had 6 Democratic senators gearing up for their presidential runs. We had Cory Booker, Amy Klobuchar, Senator Gillibrand, Senator Harris, Senator Sanders, Senator Warren. And then we get down to those final 2 for Democratic nominees of Biden and Sanders. Again, another juxtaposition of one saying he wants to ban fracking, while the other repeatedly promising that he wouldn't. And then ultimately, we know Biden gets the nomination, and it was clear the American people did not really want an extreme position on that particular issue. Fall of 2020, we're in the middle of a pandemic, we're right before the election, and we see a multi-million-dollar COVID relief package pass. What was embedded in it that got very little fanfare or airplay was a pretty significant energy bill. And that was hard to tell for members of Congress because there was such a need really for people to get those relief dollars in their pockets, so that the energy provision sort of took a back seat. And then here we are today. We see Biden is sworn in. There's a renewed focus, as Ann mentioned, on climate change to the point of where we now have a White House czar, a climate change advisor in almost every one of the federal agencies. So next slide. I just thought briefly, I'll start with our federal champions. The old adage in real estate is the true value of your property depends on 3 things: location, location, location. The same might be true when you're looking at your House and Senate members in Congress. When it comes to supporters that have influence, Congressman Tim Ryan, Eastern Ohio, Congressman Connor Lamb, Western PA, and U.S. Senator Joe Manchin in West Virginia. It's no coincidence that their districts and jurisdictions neighbor each other's borders. And I think this also emphasizes the importance of the geography. You know, we saw the first oil well in the U.S. was drilled in Western PA. The first commercial nuclear power plant was in Pennsylvania. And of course, all of these regions have a long-standing and rich history with labor unions. But not all supporters are Rust Belt folks. We've seen some pushback from to the Biden executive orders from Senator John Tester in Montana. Again, geography is important there with the Keystone Pipeline. And even Senator Whitehouse in Rhode Island. Certainly he supports the cap and trade policy, but he does see value in tax breaks for developers and property owners. And he understands that those can be advanced through infrastructure projects and recognizes the need to work with his counterparts that are in some of those purple states. And the same is sort of true at the state level in Pennsylvania, which I'll get into in a minute. Next slide. I won't go into all the provisions that was the energy stuff in the COVID relief bill, but I just wanted to highlight, because I mentioned it, that it was embedded in what was a pretty significant, Energy Act of 2020. That was probably one of the biggest energy bills we've seen in over a decade. But when you start to peel back the layers of these provisions that moved through, it was really championed and shepherded by Congressman Connor Lamb. And I know that a lot of it is really R&D related, but I think Lamb really worked with Republicans to shore up that bipartisan support at the time. And he recognized the value of these kinds of baby steps that were going to have a tremendous impact to manufacturing in Western Pennsylvania. I wanted to also just quickly highlight the three cabinet positions in particular. If you're all Netflixed out during the pandemic, it might be worth a read to go through the 67 pages of questions for the record with the Department of Energy Secretary nomination process. It will give you a great deal of insight into Senator Manchin's priorities, now that he has this newfound power as chair of the Energy Resources Committee, and also give you a sense of the priorities of the other committee members. I think it's important to note that Granholm isn't someone coming into this role from the energy sector. She's not deep in the weeds on energy policy, nor is she from, an oil-rich state like Texas with the likes of, say, a Rick Perry. But she's coming into this role with the lens of energy and how it relates to big manufacturing. When you think about her experience during the downturn of the automotive industry during the recession, combined with drinking water issues in Flint and the amount of infrastructure needs and projects in the Great Lakes region, she's going to approach the position from that perspective. She's also going to prioritize policy initiatives that can have significant and positive impact to disadvantaged and minority populations. And this is really a cornerstone of all the Biden policy proposals that we're going to see cut across all the agencies to go through sort of an equity review and how they impact those populations. Next slide. With the EPA administrator, he's extraordinarily well liked. I think he's highly regarded in a lot of rural organizations and agricultural organizations. His nomination, I think Ann pointed out, moved through the Environmental and Public Works Committee by a 14-16 vote. And that included support with Senator Burr and Senator Lindsey Graham. But again, as pointed out earlier, the biggest concern is how is he really going to coordinate with this White House advisor on climate change, as well as all the other federal agencies having these czars in place. And then also, next slide, the Secretary of the Interior nominee, who's said fracking is a danger to the air we breathe and the water we drink. She's participated in pipeline protests. Energy and interior politics is as much, again, about geography as it is party, and perhaps even more so. Almost 60% of federal onshore oil comes from New Mexico. Almost 30% of onshore federal natural gas comes from New Mexico. And New Mexico also takes over $1 billion each year in royalties. So this nominee is going to have to come to terms with that reality and her personal convictions. And that said, we can expect to see a ratcheting up of the oil and gas lease payments, more oversight on some of those sweetheart deals. We might see some interior opening to renewable energy projects like wind and solar, but with a special attention paid to tribal jurisdictions. Getting into the state stuff, instead of identifying specific members, I just sort of put a blue dog symbol up there to basically capture a portion of the Democratic caucus that I think is going to be continually supportive of the energy sector's issues. And certainly labor unions play a huge role in these policy issues that Kevin outlined for us. So in looking at Pennsylvania specifically in the Wolf administration, again, we see those continued efforts to instill a severance tax on the industry, at the same time pursuing participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Although there was support with passage of a petrochemical tax credit in the northeastern part of the state that really mirrored that southwestern PA tax credit we saw when the cracker plant came in just as Wolf was taking office. Again, geography is meaningful. When you look at those blue dog supporters who are friendly to the industry, the ones that are trying to find the middle ground on the environmental issues, those are typically the southwestern PA Democrats. We see continued and consistent support from folks like Pam Snyder, Anita Kulik, Frank Burns, Chris Sonato, Rob Matzey, and others from this region that really reflect the workforce, the industry, and the labor presence in those districts. And keep in mind, as Kevin pointed out, they're running on 2-year cycles. The governor is going to be leaving his post next time they're up for re-election. And their lack of support for something like a severance tax or RGGI is really more a reflection of the support they receive in their campaigns from the building trade sector and labor unions in particular. And going to local elected officials, I wanted to make sure that we talked about this. Again, geography plays a role. These counties and their leaders are key to advocacy with the governor and with the Biden administration. Rich Fitzgerald has been quoted time and again, the county executive of Allegheny County. U.S. Air left in 2004. Fracking really saved us. And he has said that repeatedly. He's the person that's tapped on the shoulder by the Biden-Harris campaign to go out and message the fact that they would not ban fracking entirely to the New York Times, to the LA Times. He's the one who was doing those interviews on behalf of the campaign because he carried that local credibility. I remember with Cambria County, attending an event for the Democratic commissioners there. And the rhetoric, first of all, it was headlined, the keynote speaker was Rich Fitzgerald, because he really believes in a regional approach on this issue. And, there's a lot of rhetoric around Second Amendment issues and right to life issues. And I had to think for a minute, am I at a Democratic political event? And then they come in with the importance of organized labor and their labor brothers and sisters. And that's when you knew you were there to support those democratic principles. Washington County, heart of the shale, beaver, cracker plants there. And when I've heard a lot of local officials say there are three parties in the office that they hold. There's Democrats, there's Republicans, and then there's the local mayors and county commissioners, because they're dealing with what's in front of them right there. They don't have the luxury of choosing a party. I think there's others that say the real job growth will be in the tech world, like EV and healthcare, the eds and meds, and that there are other energy sectors besides the cracker that are going to have maybe longer term growth. But no one can say the jobs are here today, and the county commissioners see what's in front of them today. These county leaders can be your best lobbyists. They're the ones greeting the president when he comes off the tarmac for Air Force One. They're the ones that are lobbying the governor for more state dollars for projects in their communities. And they're the ones involved in selecting candidates locally. They're going to probably wind up running in those state house races. There's greater access to these county commissioners, and there's more opportunity to influence policy with them. And then just when you thought that the presidential election was behind us, and it is for now, don't forget, members of Congress are already fundraising and forming their campaign committees for 2022. We're going to have an open seat for governor in Pennsylvania, which there's already buzz around the sitting attorney general contemplating a run. And then the open seat for U.S. Senate with the departure of Pat Toomey. Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman has already announced his bid for that open seat that'll be left behind with Toomey. He's been quoted time and again. I just jotted down one this morning. I'm sorry, I can't cite the publication, but he said, to pretend we can windmill and solar panel our entire nation's infrastructure is dangerous and ignores reality. And if you haven't caught the Fetterman online ad yet, note he acknowledges the town he's from in Braddock, acknowledges that it's one of those type of disenfranchised towns that Trump targeted when he won. And he acknowledges the need for the energy sector to support big manufacturing and investments to companies like U.S. Steel so they can thrive. And during the presidential race, keep in mind, even though Bernie Sanders endorsed Fetterman's first Senate run, Fetterman was clear about his support to Biden and labor and why we need to support the energy industry. And, Fetterman's only the first person to announce his run. I'm sure more are going to throw their hats in the ring. And finally, just, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, we're going to certainly see a toss up, not just at the state level as a result of the census, but, likely to lose that congressional seat in Western PA. And then that's when the crossroads and the intersections really get interesting, George.
Tracy, again, you gave me a little bit of optimism there on the opportunity, because if you think about what you just laid out and what I try to put at the very beginning of the conversation, why do we do these? We've got more than 100 people who hopefully have some sort of energy background participating today, listening. And as we started with Ann, we went through Kevin, we finished with yourself. You finished in a spot that we may be most comfortable. Township supervisors, county courthouses, and talks about, a secretary of EPA having been at North Carolina and moved up that chain. That's one of the pieces that I hope the most, that our listeners, viewers will take the opportunity to say, I do need to get engaged. My paycheck relies on it, depends on it, my family, my livelihood. And the piece that I'm preaching to the viewers is, you're educated. You know what you're talking about. No disrespect to politicians They've run for office. They're good at getting votes, but they don't know how hydraulic fracturing works. They don't understand completions. You do. And one of the things I say to our folks inside, and I will get to you, Tracy, in a moment, one of the things I say to our people in accounts payable, I don't want you to be a fracking expert. I want you to talk about how the workload on your accounts payable has gone from you paying companies $10 a month to $1,000 a month. You see a company that had 5 people that now has 55 people. That matters to people. People like Ryan in Ohio and Manchin in West Virginia. Tracy, again, it's the intersection that you raised about the people. And again, I'm very happy that you brought it to the localist level, because at the same time, you touched upon Act 66 and the need for infrastructure. How do you see, Tracy, economic development playing into this growth, if you would, at a local level, at a state level, and ultimately in DC? Is that something that you think that our viewers should be talking to their elected officials about?
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Yeah, I mean, I think we didn't even, you could probably have a whole another session on infrastructure and the return of earmarks to Congress, which is being much talked about, right? And if that does in fact happen, then we can get into advocating for those projects. And I think that's what, Connor Lamb was trying to achieve with what he did. And then I think also the other important thing, when we look at our champions at the state level, as Kevin pointed out, there's a heavy lift that's incumbent upon all of us for an education effort with all the new members that have come in. And also there's a number of, I didn't even mention, there's a number of freshmen in the southeastern part of the state where they don't understand what might happen if we enter into RGGI and how it's going to affect the electricity rates of a lot of disenfranchised populations, especially in urban areas like Philadelphia. So there's a great deal of education that needs to be done to connect those dots. But in order to connect the dots, you have to connect the dots first.
You have to know where those dots are, and what you laid out for us is a little bit, it has to do with geography, location. And to take the opportunity, and again, Kevin or Ann, if you have questions for one another, please interrupt me. I could be quiet for a moment. But the question that came in, Ann, has to do with, you got a chance to listen to Kevin's points and Tracy's points. What can states be doing to help you? And I don't mean the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I mean the Pennsylvania Chamber, the chamber from the airport area here in Pittsburgh or Wyoming County. What have you seen that might be valuable to help the efforts of AXPC, but calling upon us?
That's a great question. And I actually would reflect back to a lot of what Tracy talked about. And that is, like, we need local allies, particularly from some different voices outside of sort of the oil and gas industry, to be our best advocates. And particularly in a state like Pennsylvania in the Midwest, that often comes in the form of labor. That's still an incredibly important constituency and an incredibly important voice. But also the local county officials, local mayors, state reps who understand the importance of the industry. Really where we see our messages resonate is when we see communities who are able to speak very personally to the impact of oil and gas operations on jobs in their communities, on state budgets, and on their families. In Pennsylvania, again, labor is such an important voice. What we see with the with President Biden's order on federal lands, that really disproportionately affected a state like New Mexico. And those voices from that state, where 40% of their state budget are derived from oil and gas revenues, were really one of the most effective in pushing back. And sometimes those conversations happen quietly, not publicly, which is fine too. We'd rather them say it out loud, but when those conversations happen in closed rooms, that is useful as well. So I would say just a lot of the folks that Tracy mentioned, those local voices, sort of outside of the partisan politics that can kind of cross lines and talk about the importance and the impact, really goes a long way in Washington.
I appreciate that. Tracy, I'm sorry, were you going to add in, Tracy?
Just to say, anyone can have a conversation with Rich Fitzgerald, county executive for Allegheny, and he will tell you that if not for the ability to drill on the airport land, he doesn't know what would have happened in Western Pennsylvania from 2004 through 2010. Was a key moment where they made that decision to allow that to happen. And he certainly, with all the time that Joe Biden has spent in Western PA, he certainly has spent and heard that message through the county executive.
And I think what we strive to do here with Think About Energy is talk about these opportunities. And if it's a Susquehanna County opportunity, to make certain that Kevin knows about it in Harrisburg, or if it's as massive as the reason that the Pittsburgh airport is expanding at a time now, it has everything to do with the leadership of the county executive to allow for natural gas exploration at the airport. And again, making certain that Ann has that information so she can point to it and use it as an example, because here we go. Kevin brought up the issue. The Delaware River Basin Commission is now looking at banning the same practice that is in earnest in Susquehanna County. We're amazed because we bump up against Binghamton and Broome County, and we got Wayne to our east. And here we go. We're producing a ton of natural gas there, but those two areas aren't. And Biden potentially has the opportunity. We need to give the data and the information about the jobs created, the economic wealth, because we see that happening. So not a question there, but Kevin, I will tell you, we will do everything we can to support this. Overall, the questions are coming in on carbon and what do we do? And we've got questions in regards to what do we do to push back on how much of it's man-made versus not. And I just want to start with you just on the idea of, it looks like we're down a path. We know there are changes in climate. And what are you seeing from a standpoint of carbon policy, the opportunity of a carbon fee and the opportunity of the dividend that would be derived from that carbon fee?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I think when we talk, it's really important how we talk about this issue. And I think we should always start by sort of touting our success. And that is, the United States leads the world in carbon emissions. And that is really important to remember, because climate change is not a United States problem. It is a global problem, and it needs a global approach. So anything that sort of punitively affects the US oil and gas industry is really probably not going to make a dent in the overall issue of climate change. So I think we need to, first of all, always make sure that it is put in context. In terms of the issue of a tax on carbon, this is a really dicey one, because the design of it is just so critical. And I would also say there's not a lot of momentum for a carbon tax in DC right now. And I worry that, if the current House and Senate were designing a carbon tax, it's probably not something that we would like very much, is my sense. Because the question, there's a huge fundamental question of, like, are we taxing carbon at the point of production or at the point of the end user? And that's a really important question. So there's a lot of questions in the design. I know there's a lot of interest in it because it is sort of a market-based principle, and we like market-based principles versus a command and control approach. I'm sorry, can you hear me? So there's a lot of questions in the design that I think we need to be really careful about before we advocate on its behalf. But right now, there's also just not a lot of momentum for it as well.
Kevin, from your standpoint, understanding how much is happening at the DC level and the fact that you've got Reggie and Cap and Trade in front of you in Harrisburg, what insights do you want to pass along, having heard sort of the rest of the speakers?
Yeah, I think the misunderstanding on maybe both sides of the aisle is that industry does not want to do anything on emissions. And I don't think that could be any further from the truth. I think you would be hard pressed to find a company out there, public or privately held, that doesn't have a sustainability strategy. It's working with their vendors and their board to say what energy choices work for us and how do we cut costs and emissions. So telling those stories and putting those up front and saying this is what we're doing as responsible companies because our customers are asking about it, our shareholders are asking about it, our management's asking about it. That way, when you look at things like for a real progressive approach, which is we're going to take this bucket of energy and mandate it, we're going to take this bucket of energy and ban it, and that's how we're going to deal with this issue. I think that's just a total non-starter. But it's going to take a positive response from the business community in terms of here's how we're leading on this issue, and here's how we're deploying technology that works for us. Because as Ann mentioned, we can zero out the United States emissions tomorrow, and climate change impacts are going to still continue apace unless we're exporting technology and solutions across the world, LNG to India, LNG to Europe, to get them not only cleaner, reliable sources of energy, but away from having to rely on folks in the Middle East or Russia who don't value democracy, who don't value sustainability, and who are taking a much more different approach on human rights and the environment than we are. I think we have a good story to tell. We just need to tell it.
Well, Kevin, I can't agree with you more, and that's one of the goals. The goal is to make certain that folks who are familiar with this tell the story. They tell it at their church, they tell it at their PTA, and ultimately at the county courthouses, and move that information along. I do realize we've now run over an hour, and what I can tell you is the interest from carbon, the interest from infrastructure, economic development. It's clear that there are a lot of other areas we need to touch upon. We won't get the chance today. We will look to get some answers out to everybody else. I want to thank the three of you for joining us today on our new platform. Hopefully this has worked out. We'll get some feedback from the viewers likewise. We're seeing over 100 people participate, so we're happy there. That's a positive. But again, I can't thank you, Ann, enough, Tracy likewise, and Kevin, because you've taken the time, you've got the information. Your information on how to reach out to you has been provided. We want you to become also resources and experts for those who are taking the time to join us today. So thank you to each of you. And I have to take one moment as we end here to say back to the why we do these and what do we want to do as a result. One of the pieces that we want today is there's no call to action on House Bill 10 or House Resolution 55. But what you heard from Ann and from Kevin and from Tracy is we need to make certain that we thank our elected officials. And again, I believe, Natalie, you've got a slide that you could put up. I mean, this is just an example of what we're talking about. We are going to provide all of the viewers today with a list of legislators who from January of this year to today have helped our industry. And there's no doubt that the picture you're seeing right now is Joe Manchin. He's been outrageously helpful, but so has Pam Snyder in Pennsylvania, and Ryan Bizzarro, and Marty Flynn. There are others out there like Rich Matsey. So we're going to do all we can to get that information out so you can take a collective thank you to those elected officials. Start that dialogue with them now to ensure that they hear your voice, they know you're out there. So when those tough policy decisions are happening at the county level, at the state level, or at the national level, they know you're there, they know who you are, and they know that you're a member of their community. Because big oil or big natural gas is easy to knock upon. But when you're understood as, wait a minute, you're the person that teaches my child in Sunday school, that's different. So that's one of our efforts here today. So again, thank everybody who joined us today. Thank the panelists. We've got so many other folks from Seneca Resources to Antero to EQT, Range Resources, and the like, who all helped us promote this information out. Glad that you could be with us. We look forward to the next one. This will be on a monthly basis where we're thinking about energy, getting information out. And with that, I'm going to shut my trap, get the heck out of here. Thank you all for today.